Morning, guys. I'm sorry I couldn't meet you today, so I'll be making this presentation for our lecture on adaptation and natural selection. So first, what is adaptation? So it is the process of change where an organism becomes better suited to its current environment. So it's in a scenario where organism X is adapted to live in Y environments. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists would say that environment Y has provided the forces of natural selection that may have affected the life of X's ancestors. So it's a way where nature dictated how the organisms would live in the future. And adaptation would mean that there is a genetic change occurring or has occurred. So there are mutations within the genes that would allow them to be better suited in a particular environment. So adaptation also implies that organisms are not designed for or fitted to their present environment. They have been molded by past environments. A good example here is the giraffes. So the early ancestors of giraffes did not have such long necks in order to forage or to eat the leaves of tall trees. So because of this environment where in their habitat there are lots of lush green fresh leaves on top of trees, the giraffes have adapted so that they in order to feed. And that goes for the flippers of ducks, the hands of primates, and certain species having certain body architecture that would allow them to feed without endangering themselves. It would act as a form of self-defense. So now, the theory of evolution by natural selection. We will not really go into too much detail with this. So we're just going to run down the basic of it. So I'm sure you are familiar with the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin. This was published in 1859 along with his contemporaries. There are four propositions when it comes to the theory of evolution by natural selection. The first one is that individuals within a species show variation. So that means that no two individuals are exactly alike. Those with advantageous characters have a greater probability of survival and therefore of reproducing in the struggle for existence. Number two, some of this variation is heritable. The characteristics of an individual are determined to some extent by its genetic makeup. Individuals receive their genes from their ancestors and therefore tend to share their characteristics. So this is pretty much self-explanatory. So we inherit some of the traits from our parents, for example, and this actually in a broader spectrum applies to every organism in the world. Number three, within a given species, more individuals are produced by reproduction than can survive within the constraints imposed by the species environment. So this means that there are several organisms that produce up to thousands of offsprings in a given in their entire lifespan or life cycle. But it is more likely that some only a few of these organisms or offsprings would actually survive, and amongst the thousands of offspring produced would unfortunately die in the process, given that their environment is very harsh. 4. The number of descendants that an individual leaves depends not entirely but crucially on the interactions between the characteristics of the individual and the environment. So it will tie in with the proposition number 3, where the survivability of the descendants would actually depend on whether the inherited characters from the ancestors would actually be best suited for that particular environment. One good analogy for this is that if you are descendants of Eskimos or humans that live in higher altitudes or in higher latitudes, rather, in the temperate regions, and you are born in a very tropical climate or hot climate region, then would the interaction between the characteristics for being cold tolerant would allow you to have a better life in warmer regions. So that is what the proposition number 4 means. So what exactly is natural selection? So in any environment, some individuals will survive and reproduce better and leave more descendants than others. So that is a given fact in our environment. And this is because the inherited characters are favorable in that given environment. So in this sense, nature can be seen as loosely selecting those characteristics or favoring those characteristics. And nature is simply setting up the scene within which the evolutionary play of differential survival is played out. So going back to the example a while ago where characteristics of cold tolerant genes would not be exactly favorable in warmer climates because you won't really need to be tolerant to the cold in, let's say, the desert. But what you would need there is characteristic or genes that would help you tolerate the harsher and not harsher but the warmer climates there. So those within the population, if there are individuals with those genes favored in the harsh or the warmer environments, then those individuals are more likely to survive. So I'm sure you know the saying survival of the fittest, right? So this has been one of the major tenets of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean that you are the strongest, you are the smartest, you are the most aesthetically pleasing individual in the group, but it actually depends from case to case. One example here is, as you can see, I took a screen cap of the latest Mad Max movie where the protagonist is set into a post-apocalyptic world. In this case, there are in the lower pictures there are two scenarios where one it's more what you can call a post-apocalyptic environment where it's just chaotic and mayhem, while in this area in this scenario here it's civilized and calm, I would say. So where do you think this character would be best suited, given that his characteristics, and these are more or less hypothetical ones, so violent tendencies, the individual is territorial, he is cryptic, and does not respond to social cues, and is solitary, and is a solitary individual. I would argue that he would best fit this scenario here, but he won't necessarily survive in this scenario where it is civil, calm, and organized. He will thrive here, and he will, continue to exist in this scenario, but he is not best suited in the boardroom meeting kind of scenario or a civilized scenario. So while we're on the subject of fitness, the fitness is actually not a measure of physical prowess. Fitness is defined in ecology and evolution as the measure of the individual or measure of the ability of an individual within a population to leave the greatest number of descendants. So it's mostly a reproductive measure. So again, going back to this example, this person would not necessarily be fit in this setup, in this scenario, but he would most likely be he would fit right in the post-apocalyptic one. So he has a higher chances of survival here, and given that there are scenarios where he would find a mate, he would be able to reproduce descendants in this scenario. Going back, so although remove the fact that he's good looking, I won't think that given the characteristics he would necessarily find a mate in this scenario here. Okay, so fitness is relative and is not absolute. So there are no tangible measures for fitness, well, that I know of, and it varies from individual to individual. So it's not a law, so to speak. So here is a point of discussion that I wanted to talk to you about. Since we're on the topic of adaptation and natural selection. So what is a species? And, excuse me. So a species is a money in form of coins. The singular of a species is still a species. It is a group of organisms sharing common traits. And the plural of species is species. And it may refer to multiple separate species. So this is one of the pet peeves of taxonomists or biologists in general, is the use of the species when referring to a single organism. We use species if we're referring to the singular or to the plural. So the species concept has been debated for decades now, and up until now it's still being debated. And there are those that believe that a species is just an artificial construct. So it's just like making sense of everything in nature. And there are those that believe that species is a natural concept, so it is not a man-made concept. And there are several definitions available of a species, but the most accepted one is the biological species concept, where it is defined where species is defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed and reproduce viable, fertile offspring. So their descendants can also reproduce within the same group of species. This concept is still under scrutiny, because there are some concepts where there are some gaps in this definition of the species concept, because there are species that can actually there are organisms that can actually hybridize. So hybridize meaning they're the mix of two species, and this definition doesn't really fit that scenario. And there are one of the gaps, also another gap for this definition, is for microorganisms, for bacteria. So you know that bacteria has different variants or different strains, so it doesn't necessarily fit the biological species concept. But for now, we'll focus on this, or we are going to use this concept right here, or the definition of a species. So now on speciation. So how does species form, or how are they made? So ecological speciation is a speciation driven by the divergent natural selection in distinct subpopulations. So as you can see in this figure here, let's say this is the species, and it can actually separate into two subpopulations, where this subpopulation becomes reproductively isolated, and then in turn becomes a species of its own, and therefore it cannot interbreed with this previous species here. And there are cases where when two subpopulations combine, there will form some form of reproductive isolation. So they are not necessarily a cohesive population altogether. There are hybrids with lower fitness. And again, despite being hybrid, there are hybrids among the entire population. It will eventually be separated into two because again they cannot reproduce with one another. So it would be wrong to assume that speciation follows the orthodox scenario given. So this is the orthodox scenario. There may never be a second contact at all, and the subpopulations are completely isolated from one another. I'll be giving an example later. There is a clear variation in the importance of the pre-zygotic and the post-zygotic mechanisms. So this goes with the concept of developmental biology that we will not be discussing, but it's an important concept to remember, meaning pre-zygotic, so before the embryos are formed and after the embryos are formed. And most importantly, there are two types of speciation that goes outside the orthodox concept. One is allopatric speciation, and second is the sympathic speciation. So this figure demonstrates the allopatric and the sympathic speciation. So first, allopatric. So in the allopatric speciation, so we have the entire population here of trees, and if you notice here, there is a physical barrier. So in allopatric speciation, there is a form of geographical isolation happening that causes the one population to be divided into two species. A good analogy for this, or a good example for this, is Mount Talinis. So if you notice in the Negros Island region, that in Negros Oriental, we have our language is Bisaya, and on the other side, in Negros Occidental rather, the language is Ilonggo. So while it is not a complete speciation, but the reason for the division could be because of the geographical isolation. And you might be wondering why, despite having a geographical isolation of Negros Oriental between Cebu and the other islands like Siquijor, it would make sense that it's easier to travel by sea, by boat, than to actually climb a mountain and going down on the other side. So that's one of the reasons for the division, for the difference in the language in the Negros Island region. Second, sympatric speciation. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, is mostly speciation by reproductive isolation. There may be several mechanisms to reproductive isolation, and we'll discuss this in the later sessions. But there may be some. Let me rephrase that. There are certain characteristics that are favored by nature itself, and aside from that, there are certain characteristics that are favored by an individual within the population. That's why there are some. A good example would be mating calls by birds, where you can actually where the female actually chooses its partner based on how good the mating call is. So because of that behavior, certain females might reject the individual with the bad mating call and would favor individuals with the better mating call. And because of that reproductive isolation, there might be a species formed within that population that would actually use that form of mating call instead to attract mates. So these are the two speciations in ecological speciations. So probably the best example of speciation is Darwin's finches. So in Galapagos Island, when Charles Darwin went there on an expedition, he noticed that the finches have different beak shapes, and he concluded that the ancestral ground finch in the Galapagos Island were seed eaters, and he noticed that each of the finches, each shape of the finch's beak would correspond to a specific diet. So you have the ones here that mainly feed on insects, and each beak would actually correspond to a specific insect. So one might the ones with big beaks might prefer those insects with a harder exoskeleton, while the ones with narrow beaks would prefer the smaller insects. Aside from that, there are finches that actually feed on the fruits and buds, and there are finches that feed on the cactus seeds and parts, having a stronger or sharper beak to penetrate the rind of the cactus. And there are ones that have that feed mainly on seeds. So you have one here and another one here, the small ground finch and the sharp beak ground finch, where they actually feed on the smaller seeds, while the large ground finch and the medium ground finch have larger beaks to accommodate for larger seeds or harder seeds with harder shells. And this is all in one island. In different parts of the island, there are different finches that correspond to different that adapted to different diets. So there are other factors to consider when studying speciation of organisms. So the first is the movement of land masses. So first is the movement of the plate tectonics, which we'll be discussing in future sessions. And the rise and sink of islands. So one good example is the Philippines, where, if I'm not mistaken, the Philippines arose 5 million years ago. I will double check that. Geological history, another factor to consider. So we have the extinctions and radiation of species. So let's say that species A is a predator of species B, but because of a geological event or catastrophe, species A become extinct, and therefore allowed species B to thrive and form larger populations that would end up breaking into different subpopulations and forming their own respective species. Third one is climate changes. So the one we're experiencing now is one but many of several climate change events that the world has faced. Throughout history, throughout the millions or billions of years of history that the Earth has, it has experienced lots of climate change events, from very high temperatures to the what the geologists would call thermal maximums, and to eras or time where it's really cold, like the snow age or the ice age events throughout history. And these extreme fluctuations in temperature would actually drive speciation and extinction rates of several organisms. So would be organisms that would survive the ice age and then flourish after the ice has melted, and so on. And there are another thing to consider is actually the biomes, which we'll be discussing next meeting. So this is a very good diagram for the biomes, where on the x-axis it's the amount of rainfall, and on the y-axis it's temperature. So on very low temperature to very low rainfall, you have the tundra, so the coldest places on Earth, and with the highest temperature and the highest amount of rainfall or precipitation, the tropical rainforests that we have, similar to the ones we have in Southeast Asia in general. and also aquatic biomes, which we'll be discussing in the future. And for a comprehensive list, this is the matching communities with their biomes. So there are organisms that are best suited, or species rather, that are well adapted to these biomes. So as a breakdown, we have the terrestrial biomes and the aquatic biomes. The aquatic biomes we will further divide into the freshwater and the marine, but all in all, these are what we consider the aquatic biomes, and these are the terrestrial biomes. This is a good map from, I forgot the title of the book. I think it is the book that I gave you, provided you. So this is a map of how these biomes are distributed worldwide. So in the higher latitudes, you have the polar ice and the tundra, then the taiga, and as we go lower and lower to this equator, it becomes hotter. Assignment, I have no assignment to give you, but we might have a quiz next meeting. So please prepare and review this. If you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email and ask questions. I'll be posting this lecture on our virtual classroom, as well as the notes or the slideshow in our virtual classroom. That would be all, guys. Thank you very much and have a nice day.